All right, we're going to do this one sans video camera because it wasn't really cooperating with me. Something went wrong with the initialization, so we're just going to talk about the executive and the compromises they had to come to around the executive. Now, the idea of a national executive was not new and was not crazy. In fact, the idea of a national executive was something that John Locke had talked a great deal about. He saw that the national executive would have what he called the federative power, as well as a variety of what he would call prerogative powers, the powers to act in the national interest when the legislature couldn't, the power to act in a federative manner, to act for all, or to act for the legislature when it came to international relations, things like that. So the idea of framing an executive was not utterly new. However, the idea of framing a national executive who was not a king and was not a member of the national legislature was. And so we have some much more basic challenges. All right, sorry about that. One of the first challenges that they have to deal with is how many executives to actually have. I know this seems crazy, but it was a question. Do you only have one? Do you have a president and a co-president? Do you have president and a vice president? Do you have a whole council? There was a triumvirate in Rome that exercised a great deal of executive power. How do you do it? Now, ultimately, they do decide on only one, although there is a vice president whose role is unclear. Who and how are they dependent on? Is it going to be dependent on the legislature to get its power? On the people? On the states? Who is it better to make it dependent on? The legislature is already an expression of the people's will, so do we need another in the executive? The states already have independent power on their own. They have executives that are governors. Do they need a say in the national executive? Do they need a say? Would that be too much power? How long should they stay in office? Do we need limited terms? Do we need a long term or a short term? Should they be removable from office by the legislature? Should they be removable from office by the people? How should we deal with this new power in the presidency? Now, ultimately, we end up deciding on 4-year terms without a limit and on a crazy electoral college system to set up how to bring the guy into office. The electoral college system that will include some people as decided on by the state legislatures, and we've discussed that at great length elsewhere. How to get rid of him. If we have a bad president who's there 2 years in, and you're not going to recall him because you haven't set up a direct electoral system, how to get rid of him? Well, they set up this system called impeachment. Now, impeachment was not original. Impeachment was not totally new to them. They had had a system of impeachment for judges and for things like that. But the presidential impeachment setup that we end up with in the final Constitution is an expression of the difficulty of figuring out an executive who was not dependent directly on the people or directly on the states, who could have as many terms as they wanted, but was limited to 4 years. We'll talk a lot about the impeachment setup in our clause-by-clause reading. What kind of powers should he have? What extent do the foreign powers go to? Can he make treaties on his own, or does he need the approval of the legislature? Locke would have said that the federative power is immense, that the federative power should include almost all foreign relations powers. There shouldn't be a whole lot of consultation with the legislature, except maybe in the case of war. Ultimately, we'll see what foreign powers they decide on for the president. But the philosophical basis is that the president is the most unified voice. And the president's unified voice will make him best at negotiation, will make him best at military command, and will make him best at appointments. So that's the philosophy behind the foreign powers. And we'll get to what those specific foreign powers are in our clause-by-clause reading. But that's the idea behind it. Finally, how should he interact with the legislature? Does he need to interact with the legislature at all? He's going to be signing and executing their bills, so it seems clear to the framers that he needs to have some say over what those bills are, and he needs to have some method of interacting with and discussing problems with the legislature. But ultimately, the question becomes, should he be able to veto laws that he thinks are bad? Madison proposes a series of absolute vetoes. Other people say that the president should not have any kind of veto, and you need to rely on a court or a council of revision to do that. But ultimately, he does not have an absolute veto. Instead, you have a 2/3 override requirement which we'll get to as we do the clause-by-clause reading. But again, the challenge of the executive is in figuring out how dependent he is on the legislature, and therefore how much he should check and balance the legislature. The judiciary does get some time in the Constitutional Convention. Not a lot, but it certainly gets some. How many national courts do we get? Well, we're going to have a national court. That's decided right off. But what kind of powers will it need? It will need to hear national and very, very important issues to the general public, but particularly what those are is very difficult. And when we wrestle with Article 3, we'll discuss this in great depth. But there's not a lot of attention paid to the specific sphere of the national courts, except for a general fear that an overly powerful national court will overrule state laws, in particular state laws that states are deeply attached to, like laws about morality, religion, slavery. So they know it needs to be there, and they know it needs to hear national, not state issues, but beyond that, it's going to be difficult. One thing they do in that section is to enshrine certain basic legal principles that they think are very important to the Anglo-American system of common law. So right there in the Constitution, in Article 3, almost without any debate, they decide that there will be trial by jury, there will not be ex post facto laws, trials have to happen in a convenient place where witnesses and juries and judges can make it and are familiar with the details of the case, and that the federal jurisdiction should be specific and should be limited. So this is all in keeping with those big, broad principles of enumerated powers, of checks and balances, and things like that we've been discussing. It's also in line with those big, deep philosophical influences like Blackstone and Koch and Locke, going all the way back. They decide on some other interesting things. They decide that justices and judges really ought to be paid, but how much? Well, we're not sure about. Who should select them? They give the executive some power in that. These are all things that we'll see in the actual clause-by-clause reading, but it's important to see that these are issues of discussion. Some of the most difficult ones, actually, are selection and tenure. A lot of people are interested in having the justices selected by the states, for example, or having a much shorter tenure than lifetime. The whole discussion in the Federalist Papers isn't actually around the basic legal principles. It isn't really around the types of national courts or the need for a national court. The discussion during ratification is about, why are we paying these guys? Why does the president get to select them? And why should they stay on for life? So, although these are important compromises, they're also the ones that are the source of a great deal of dissent at the actual Constitutional Convention. Finally, we have to talk about the relationship between this new government that's going to be grounded on the people, not on the states, and the states themselves. First of all, we have this very difficult thing called unity of sovereign power. We know that sovereign power has to lie somewhere. And in a popular sovereignty system, it does go to the people. But when the government rules, its laws are considered sovereign because the people have granted power and all that stuff we talked about in our natural rights section. But we're going to have to settle on a principle to govern the relationships between the federal government and the state governments. The first way we see this is in the Supremacy Clause that says the areas that the government is given specific enumerated powers to work on, in those areas it is absolutely supreme. The states may not impinge. In Article 1, Section 9, there's also a series of areas where the states are specifically forbidden to impinge just in case they even thought about it. And there are a series of things in Article 4 that are known as interstate obligations, things some of which we saw in the Articles of Confederation, like the requirement to extradite criminals. There's a very difficult discussion about debt and what to do with state debt and currency powers and economic powers. And again, this is all stuff that we'll see come up during our reading, but these are the big debates. How unified should sovereign power be? What is it that states can't do, in particular in the economic realm? Because remember that many of the framers at the convention are worried about things like rampant state debt, rampant state creation of paper money that's undermining the system of currency and trade, and so on. So there's a whole list of things that states can't do that come out in Article 2, Section 10. Who do the new officials of the government owe loyalty to? Do they owe loyalty to their states? Do they owe loyalty to the people? This has gotten around in an interesting way during a few days of debate at the convention, when it's determined that they will swear oaths to the Constitution itself. And this is what I want to spend just a second on, because I think it's very interesting. The idea that the Constitution itself is in some way a specific enumerated document is something the framers are doing in a new way. Remember that the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and all those things were not really the English Constitution. The English Constitution was unwritten and interpreted through the common law. So now we have a document, and not only do we have a document, we are taking oaths to it, not to morality, not to natural law, not to the government itself, not to the president, not to the Congress, which is expressing the will of the people, but to the Constitution. In a lot of ways, the fact that our national officials take oaths to the Constitution is one of the first times we see the idea that American politics and culture are deeply constitutional. That when we have fights about policy, we like to talk about the Constitution. So I just want to give you a note about that. Finally, how are we going to put this document into effect? Once we've written it, how do we have it happen? Clearly, it's not just a set of amendments to the Articles. It's going to replace, completely end the Articles. So we can't have it brought into action in the same way that an Articles amendment was. First of all, because Articles amendments were impossible to get done. And second of all, because we have seen that Articles amendments were not sufficient to the problem at hand, at least according to the Philadelphia Convention. So are the people going to do it, or are the states going to do it? This is a really interesting question, and it goes to the root of the radicalism of the convention. If the state governments are sovereign, and the state governments are going to be the composing units of the new federal union, then the states should do the ratifying. But if the government is getting its grant of power fundamentally from the popular sovereignty of the people, then the people should do the ratifying. And the clever compromise that ends up happening is that you have to have the people of the several states ratify. Now, state legislatures don't get to do it, and there's an interesting problem called the antes leges posteriori problem that I don't have time for here. But there's lots of reasons that the state legislatures can't do it. And the Articles Congress can't do it, because the Articles Congress is not getting its power from the states. It's from the people, it's getting its power from the states. So instead, the people will ratify, but not as a body. The people of each state will ratify. So it's ambiguous. The people are ratifying it, yes, it's getting its power directly from the people. But not the people as a whole, the people of each state. And you need 9 states to do it. You need 9 out of the 13, very different than needing the unanimity of the Articles. This is really interesting, particularly because it means you could not get the 4 most important states, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and you could still have the Constitution go into effect for all the states that had signed it. They knew, in fact, it was written in, that the Constitution would go into effect for all the 9 states that had signed the minute 9 states had signed on. Very interesting. So they were taking a risk with this. In particular, they were taking a risk in acknowledging that it was entirely separate from the Articles Congress. Now, the Articles Congress also had to agree. The Articles Congress had to send it off to the states. This was also a risk. Would the Articles Congress agree to basically condemn itself to death? Now, fortunately, it did, but it had to actually say, hey, states, the Philadelphia Convention has come up with this new idea. Here's the 9 out of 13 rule. Here's the state convention rule. Have your way with it. But they did so. And finally, what should the convention itself do? Did the convention itself have any powers? Should there be a vote at the end of the convention on the final document? Do they have to be unanimous? The people who are part of the convention have been coming and going. The door has been closed the entire time. There's been secrecy as a rule during the convention. What's the role of the people and the convention itself? Ultimately, they decided virtually none. The document they have has to stand on its own merits. There are actually 2 very prominent people, in particular George Mason of Virginia, who refused to sign. at the end of the convention. But the convention decides to keep going and send out the document, even though they don't have unanimous or even necessarily greatly enthusiastic support among the people there. And what's crucial to understand is that at this moment, when it goes out to the states, that is really the first time anyone hears the results of what happened in Philadelphia. Because of the secrecy rule, no one knew what the discussion was really about. It was the talk of the town. As an example, universities in the United States had debating societies, and they would be debating things during the months of the convention, like, was it a good idea to send delegates to the convention back a couple of months ago? What do you think the convention will say? We don't know. Very good stuff. So those are the big issues. All of them come back to the fundamental principles we've talked about, principles of natural right, principles of natural law, principles of popular sovereignty, of limited government, of balancing the government. But I wanted to give you a more detailed view of the specific compromises and the specific discussions that were going on at the convention. So let's talk about the post-convention era for just a minute. We're going to go into some more detail about this after we do our clause by clause. But the ratification debates themselves are a very interesting moment in American history. They're probably the most participatory moment in American democracy. For months, people are publicly reading, publicly discussing, reading editorials about the new Constitution. It generates huge amounts of public debate, press debate. There are parades. One of my favorite moments is down there in the left-hand corner where the New York Federalists build the good ship Madison and parade it through the streets of New York to try to convince people to sign on to the Constitution. Each state has its own way of doing things. Each state elects delegates from each area of the state to go to a state convention. These people are not members of the state legislatures because state legislatures are not allowed to do the ratifying. And each of these state conventions has long debates. Sometimes these people come and go, they don't stay. Oftentimes there's tremendous debate back home in their districts. So someone will go back home, sit down in a town meeting, talk to the inhabitants of Orange County, and then turn right back around and go back to their state convention. It's a long process, and it's a very participatory one. And it's one that is not a foregone conclusion. Because remember, the Anti-Federalists, their objections to the Constitution, which we're going to go over in some detail after we read the Constitution, their objections to the Constitution were not simple-minded. Their objections to the Constitution did not amount to a call for a return to the Articles. Right? They just didn't have coordination. They didn't have a single set of objections. And despite having brilliant minds like George Mason and Samuel Adams among them, they didn't have an alternative plan. They acknowledged that there were problems with the Articles. After all, Mason had gone to the convention. But they couldn't figure out exactly what the specific solutions to those problems were. They were just convinced that the Constitution, as it came out of Philadelphia, was not a sufficient way to solve those problems. They had a lot of objections, and we'll talk about them later. The Federalists, on the other hand, had a strategy. The Federalists knew that they wanted to convince people of the severity of the problems under the Articles. And remember, a lot of people had never experienced the problems of the Articles. If you were a tobacco farmer in Eastern Virginia who couldn't get your trade ships organized, yes, you experienced the problems. But if you were a poor farmer in upstate New York who was just concerned about Native American raids, you had not experienced the problems. So Madison and Hamilton and Jay and Washington and other prominent Federalists, they had a strategy of using newspaper publishing to get their case for why the Constitution was good and why the Articles were terrible and why the Anti-Federalist case was not sufficient for rejecting the Constitution. And they write a series of essays called the Federalist Essays that are sort of probably one of the most concise explanations of the political philosophy of the Constitution you'll ever read. And we're going to read several of them after our clause-by-clause read-through. Ultimately, the ratification comes down to two most important conventions, New York and Virginia. New York and Virginia are the two biggest, most prosperous, most powerful states, and they take the longest to ratify. Now, some states do take longer. Ultimately, Rhode Island doesn't ratify until well after all the other states. But the two states that take the longest and are most important are New York and Virginia, particularly New York. And so the Federalists end up really concentrating their newspaper publishing effort, their strategy, their coordination of arguments on New York, while the Anti-Federalists are more spread out. They're more parochial. They're concentrating on their own states, and once New Hampshire ratifies, many of the New Hampshire Anti-Federalists throw up their hands and give up, rather than continuing to contribute to the debate in other states. So that's a little bit about the ratification process now that you've looked at the major compromises at the convention. I hope these 3 videos have been useful to you. I know they go into a lot of detail, but what's important to recall about the whole of that detail is that each of the big issues that were being discussed and compromised on at the convention, often very vehemently, these people did not agree about why or how to solve their problems. Each of them was part and parcel of the problems of the Articles and the larger philosophical and organizational ideas that we have discussed in earlier classes about the fundamental ideals of government. All right, I'll see you guys next time when we start our clause-by-clause read-through of the U.S. Constitution.